First off, we want to thank Senators Tom Carper and Chris Coons for being here, as well as Congressman John Carney. And it really does speak well of you guys as a delegation that you can all sort of get together and sit down and have a conversation.
And look, just alike. I mean,
and all kind of matching. That's right.
That's
now,
true.
if we could only get
right down to the flags.
Now, if we could only get your colleagues in Washington to sort of agree to a similar thing, to kind of sit down and talk things out. And as we look at the sequester, is this really kind of a continuation of the 2008, 2010 election cycles, that we're still sort of fighting similar battles that we fought in campaigns, now with a lot more on the line?
Next question. No, before we do that, let me just say, we're dressed alike. We don't always dress alike, but we always act alike. And what we do, we go to Washington and we really channel Delaware. This is a state that works, where Democrats and Republicans work together. We like each other. We're fiscally responsible. We govern from the middle. And that's really, we try to set a personal example. It's John in the House and Chris and I in the Senate every single day to be more fiscally responsible. In Delaware, we believe if things are worth having, they're worth paying for. And we're also pretty good at squeezing a dime to make sure we're getting our money's worth.
At a big picture level, the disagreement between the House and the Senate that's been going on now for years continues as the budget committees of both the House and the Senate are moving forward budget resolutions. And the point you opened with, is the sequester really just a continuation of the fight of the 2012 election, is proven out to be true by the differences in our budgets. The Ryan budget is largely unchanged from the platform that Governor Romney ran on for president. Significant new tax cuts, I mean trillions of dollars in new tax cuts, used not to reduce the deficit but to reduce the rates that are paid by the wealthiest Americans. And it would likely result in a tax increase for most middle-class Americans, while also fundamentally changing Medicare and Medicaid, turning Medicaid into a block grant to the states and turning Medicare into a voucherized sort of individual payment plan program. The Democratic budget, which has come out of the committee and we will be taking up very shortly, has fundamentally different values. It focuses on trying to create jobs, on reinvesting in infrastructure, on the things we need to do to make the American economy grow, and it keeps our promises to our seniors and our veterans while still making significant cuts that reduce the deficit.
There's plenty of blame, I guess, to go around on both sides of the aisle. Can we agree on that? That you know, if you talk to people, they think, oh well, the Republicans aren't compromising. If you talk to other people, they say the Democrats aren't compromising. There's parts of both plans that maybe can be cobbled together for a compromise. That's sort of what our government system is all about, right?
Absolutely, and I'm actually more optimistic than I was when I first elected the last 2 years over on the House side. Obviously, it's a lot more partisan, it seems to me. But I've noticed a difference, frankly, since the election. I think people heard from their constituents back home, cut it out. You know, stop this partisan bickering, get something done. And the first thing to get done is to pass a budget, which we haven't done in some time. Senator Coons, I think, described the differences between the two budgets very well. And it's not as if the two sides aren't standing on a certain amount of principles. On the Republican side, it tends to be taxes, no tax of any kind. And on the Democratic side, you know, we hold tight to those social programs that are so important to the constituencies that we represent. The reality is that if we're going to preserve Medicare and Medicaid and some of those important programs, we've got to reform them in certain ways. And healthcare really is the biggest part of this dilemma going forward, mostly because of demographics. And if we're going to have something that's a balanced approach, it's going to have to include new revenues, and what better way to do it than to improve our tax code through tax reform, generate some revenues to reduce the deficit, as well as come up with a tax code that's better for economic growth.
And this whole sequester idea was kind of set up as the stick instead of the carrot to get an agreement done, that these things would be so terrible that no one would push off an agreement to let these things happen. But now they're sort of happening, and we're seeing a lot of impacts here in Delaware and around the country. Is this any way to run government, to run, you know, the leader of the free world?
As my colleagues know, I like to ask people who have been married a long time, 50, 60, 70 years, what's the secret to being married a long time? And I get some hilarious answers, but I also get some very good ones. And one of the best ones I've ever heard are the 2 C's, not Carney and Coons, but communicate and compromise. And that's what we need to do. In 1997, a fellow named Erskine Bowles was the President Clinton's chief of staff, and he negotiated a deficit reduction deal that was a 50-50 deal. Half revenues, half spending, and it led to 4 balanced budgets in a row. And Erskine Bowles, along with former Republican Senator Alan Simpson, has led a similar effort at the bequest of President Obama. Again, instead of a 50-50 deal, it's about a 3-to-1 deal, $3 on the spending side, $1 on the revenue side. And as John said, the president says, we can't get from here to there, from big deficits to closer to a balanced budget, without making sure that on the entitlement program spending is over half of our budget and growing. What we call discretionary spending, defense, and the rest of the domestic budget is actually going down and has been going down for about 50 years. The president says on the entitlement programs we need to really do 3 things. 1, make sure we don't savage old people or poor people. 2, reform the programs to save money. And 3, preserve these programs for the long haul. We can't do it by ignoring the entitlement programs. By the same token, when we had those 4 balanced budgets in a row during the Clinton administration, federal revenues as a percentage of gross domestic product, somewhere between 19 and 20%. Last year, federal revenues as a percentage of GDP, about 15 to 16%. So we need some additional revenues as well.
Is that something we can get back to just sort of do what was done before? It seemed to work before the numbers sort of pair that out.
Well, to offer some sense of the progress we've made, the so-called Bowles-Simpson Commission, which Senator Carper just referred to, and many other groups that looked at our long-term structural problems with our deficit, said 2 years ago we needed to achieve about $4 trillion in savings over 10 years. And between all the different things that we've done, we've put in place about $2.4 trillion in savings over 10 years. That's both in reduced federal spending and in the new revenue from the so-called fiscal cliff deal back in January. The sequester was a piece of the deal that was done back in August of 2011. And we are really frustrated and upset with the impact that we're hearing from our constituents, whether at Dover Air Force Base or the FAA or other federal agencies, or its impact on local governments. And it's my hope that we will shortly replace it with a much smarter way to achieve the same savings, giving some flexibility to federal agencies. Out of that $2.4 trillion we've already done, the budget that's going to be coming forward on the Democratic side in the Senate has an additional $1.8 trillion in savings, which gets us to about that $4 trillion goal. So I know that these short-term crises, the on-again, off-again, sort of back and forth of it isn't very reassuring or encouraging. As you put it, this is no way to run a government. But we are steadily making progress towards hitting the reduction in federal savings, the modest increase in revenue, that in combination could put us on a sustainable path towards reducing our deficits overall. So we are making progress. We are having a very hard time compromising and listening to each other. Not the 3 of us, but many others in Congress simply are not willing to move off their opposition to any reforms or any changes to entitlement programs or any increase in revenue. I'm someone, and so are my colleagues, who's willing to make principled compromise to achieve the progress that we have to make in order to both grow jobs, grow our economy, get us back on a more sustainable track, and to deal with our structural deficits.
Congressman Carney.
But what we have to do is we really have to start the reform part of it, particularly in health care. We've got to change the way we pay providers, physicians and others, pay for performance instead of for procedures. That sounds easy, but it's a lot more difficult to do. The Affordable Care Act puts in place a lot of pilots across the country. The information we're getting from that has been very positive. In fact, over the last 3 years, excuse me, healthcare costs have flattened out. So we need to continue to pursue that. And we also need to do government reform, and Senator Carper is going to be right at the vortex of that, leading the committee as chair. He's got as his to-do list, I hear it quite a bit, the GAO report on areas in the government that we can reform, and we need to get savings there. I've heard from retired generals that there's a lot of waste in the Defense Department, 40% overhead, healthcare programs and the like. We need to look at those as well and get real savings through reform and greater efficiency before we just arbitrarily cut and slash programs that are important to so many people.
Do you have any interaction with the members on the GOP side
in
the House, with Representative Ryan? Are they willing to sort of listen and have a conversation sort of in the hallways?
Well, they're kind of two sets. You know, there there are people that are plugged into the leadership side on both sides, you know, and they've got their talking points and they're firmly ensconced in the back and forth. And then there are ordinary members, like I would consider myself, and we get together on a regular basis. I actually co-chair a bipartisan breakfast group. We get together every 2 weeks. We're meeting this week. And I think the idea of government reform and government efficiency is certainly an area where Democrats and Republicans can get together and agree. We actually, in our first meeting, came up with a series of legislative proposals to address veterans issues. Again, another area where Democrats and Republicans can agree. I think you have to go through this process of finding ways where you do agree and looking for common ground, as opposed to always concentrating on the talking points, bashing the other side in order to move the ball down the field.
And with this sort of kind of hanging over Washington, is there a chance for other things to get done? You all have worked together on the National Park for Delaware. Is that something that is sort of pushed aside? I know there's been a little bit of movement on that. Is that something that can get done when all this is kind of hanging over as a cloud?
I think it's difficult. Senator Coons serves on the Energy National Resources Committee. They've reported out
it came out of committee on Thursday.
Our legislation. We're grateful for all that he's done there. You know, we have 49 other states. We got about 6 territories. Every one of them have a unit of a national park or a national park. There's like 400 of them. For 100 years, we've been paying taxes in Delaware for other states to have a national park. The #1 tourist destination for people from other countries when they come to the U.S. is our national parks. And we don't have one, but we've got a great story to tell. And the theme that we've agreed on over the last, with the Bush administration, with the Obama administration, is early colonial settlement leading up to the ratification of the Constitution in 1787. It's a great concept. I think eventually we'll get there. In fact, I'm encouraged it'll happen this year. It is a national park on the cheap. And we found a way to offset the cost of the national park so that it does not increase the budget deficit. But it will increase the flow of tourists to come to our state, to learn about our history and the role that Delaware played, and to buy things here, to stay here, to eat here, to sleep here, to shop here, and enjoy the benefits of tax-free shopping.
As we're running out of time, one thing we do here at WHYY when we do voter forums, we go out and talk to voters, usually election cycles. We ask them what their hope and fear sort of is for the coming election and the results of that. So we'll sort of repeat that here with you guys. Hope and fear of this process of sequester and moving beyond and for the rest of this year, the rest of this term.
This is a country that survived a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and won the Cold War. We can get through all that. We can get through this. The keys are communicate and compromise. The thing that I hear most from people around Delaware, and I suspect John and Chris do as well, is why can't Washington be more like Delaware, to communicate and to compromise? The other thing I hear a lot is people say, I don't mind paying a little more taxes, but I want to make sure you don't waste our money. That goes back to the point that John made. We've got to look at everything we do in the government and say, how do we get a better result for less money?
My fear is that partisan politics at the national level will prevent the kind of interpersonal compromise, communication, and reasonableness that I've found with some of the other senators who I've gotten to know individually. My hope is that individual compromise relationships will make it possible after we get the House budget and the Senate budget passed. I think there's going to be a window of 2 to 3 months where, with leadership from President Obama and with some hard work and listening to each other by members of the House and Senate, there's a very real possibility that we'll get this so-called big deal done that's eluded us, and we'll set the country on a very positive path that'll grow the economy again, that'll create better jobs for the people of the United States through a robust private sector, and that'll allow us to move forward on the so many other issues that we ought to be addressing in Congress.
Could I just underline one thing that Chris said, and that is leadership from President Obama. The President's got to lead. He's got to lead. I think he knows that, and I think he's reaching out to the Republicans and providing the leadership we need. But it's just not up to a legislative body to take this on by themselves without the President. And John was our Secretary of Finance. You know, we didn't just say, and I was governor, we didn't just say to the legislature, okay, you figure out these financial challenges. No, the governors have to lead.
But you think the next deal will not have another deadline that's going to put us sort of back in this position? Because we had the fiscal cliff, then we had the sequester. The next one will not have another sort of...
You know, it could. But as long as we continue to move the ball down the field in a meaningful way. Senator Coons mentioned what we've done so far. And it's not been pretty, but we actually have made some progress. My greatest hope is that we actually can lean in on healthcare reform and this cost-saving side of it. Because if we don't do that, it won't matter really how much we're cutting out of defense and domestic discretionary spending, because the budget will start to accelerate in the out years just because of sheer demographics, the aging of the population. So we have to do something now. And I think one of the big things that I try to do is communicate that to the people here in our state, because they're really kind of, it's not right in front of us. It's not this year, it's not next year. Frankly, it's not 5 or 10 years down the road. But guess you get beyond that horizon and it's a big problem. But if you don't do something about it today, it's impossible to deal with when it's right in your face. My greatest fear is that we slip back. I think we've moved forward in terms of working together, that we slip back to the partisanship which really plagued my side of the Capitol, the House side, in the last Congress, and we just fight about this or that or the other thing. We don't focus on doing what's the best thing for the country. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's my greatest fear.
All right, well, one thing we can all hope for is that we will continue this conversation. Senator Tom Carper, Senator Chris Coons, and Congressman John Carney make up Delaware's congressional delegation, and we thank you for joining us on First.